course, the cloth would have been draped around the body. So what Dr. Lavoie pointed out, which is again obvious to me once I've seen it, once he showed it, is that the blood stains from the face, some of them are superimposed on the image of the hair, which is what you'd expect, because if you drape a cloth around something, say there's some contact process that formed the image, then once you straighten the cloth out, the image is going to be distorted. They call it, I think, the mask of Agamemnon effect, that it will stretch out, and that distortion is there for the bloodstains. It's not there for the image. So what we have, therefore, is evidence that at the moment that the bloodstains formed, the cloth was draped around the recumbent body of the man who had recently died after having been tortured and crucified. And then there was a second event, perhaps in the tomb, where it appears as though the body was no longer recumbent; it was vertical. But then, if you look at the position of the feet, it doesn't look like he was standing. So it looks as though this body had moved from the horizontal position to the vertical and is now suspended upright above the ground. And based upon the evidence from Dr. Di Lazzaro and his team's work, it appears that there was a sudden momentary burst of radiant energy that came from the body of the man. And I don't call it upwards and downwards, I call it forwards and backwards. If he was upright, forwards and backwards from what's known anatomically as the coronal plane of the body.
Well, hello guys. I'm here with a man called Dr. Andrew Silverman, and Dr. Andrew Silverman has been conducting research on the mind-matter continuum and near-death experiences for over 30 years. He is a medical doctor and author of A Burst of Conscious Light. His findings have been presented in peer-reviewed scientific papers and at international scientific conferences. He has presented papers to the Scientific and Medical Network and the Society for Scientific Exploration. At an annual SSE conference in San Francisco, he was introduced as a pioneer among a new generation of scientists who see that evidence from many disparate fields of inquiry all points to a conclusion that consciousness is fundamental and not merely a product of matter. At that conference, he was a member of a panel of 3 scientists for a panel discussion on the topic of whether consciousness could ever be manufactured. In his book, A Burst of Conscious Light, Dr. Andrew Silverman provides evidence that human consciousness can never be reproduced and exposes the perils of artificial intelligence. Some of the plaudits for his book are included below. This groundbreaking book presents cogent scientific evidence that the light that many people experience in near-death experiences is not an artifact of a dying brain, but is indeed the fundamental basis for existence itself. A very original book that is based on up-to-date interpretations of modern science, highly recommended. And that's from Pim van Lommel, a cardiologist and author of Consciousness Beyond Life. Dr. Silverman's brilliant opus represents an important milestone in catalyzing this world awakening, which ultimately will weave science and spirituality together again for the betterment of all humankind. And that comes from Eben Alexander, neurosurgeon and author of Living in a Mindful Universe, Proof of Heaven and the Map of Heaven. Well, welcome, Dr. Silverman. Very happy to be able to speak to you today.
Thank you. I'm very happy to be here.
Thank you. And I just was wondering, as a medical doctor, why did you become interested in consciousness in the first place?
Well, I was actually interested in consciousness since before I was a medical doctor. Even in my childhood, my friend's dad recalls the day when I was 12 years old, and there was a discussion going on about existence. And he said, "So how do you know you exist?" And I said, I think, therefore I am. I was already obviously I'm quoting Descartes there, but I was already convinced, just from simple reasoning, that consciousness is the one thing that we can be completely sure of, even if everything that we experience were an illusion, and I don't claim it is. There has to be someone to perceive the illusion. So I've always been fascinated by consciousness my whole life, as I'm sure a lot of people are.
Mm-hmm. Would you say this is like subjectivity and objectivity? You were interested in that dichotomy?
Yeah, I sort of was, but I was, well, as I explain in the book, my view is that there ultimately there cannot be one without the other, and this is what quantum theory itself demonstrates in the importance of the observer in making reality real, and not just with sort of subatomic particles, but as people like Erwin Schrödinger, and more recently eminent cosmologist and scientist physicist at Stanford University, Andre Linde, has pointed out several times that he believes that there cannot be a physical universe. It can't exist without consciousness. And he actually explained why, and put this in his textbook on inflationary cosmology in the 1990s. And he tells a story that his publishers said, if you put this in talking about consciousness, you may lose the respect of some of your readers and colleagues. And he said, if I don't include it, I will lose my self-respect, because it was a position he was drawn to, not through any belief, faith, or religion, or anything like that, but it's just what reason tells you when you actually look at quantum physics. That's what it's telling you. And in fact, I believe it was Eugene Wigner who said that once quantum mechanics began to be understood, it began to be impossible to understand the nature of physical reality without saying that consciousness has to be a part of it, or has to exist for it to be there.
So is this what you mean in your book when you say that you're not advocating the position that existence is some type of dream, or that it has no objective reality?
Yes, because existence includes the fact that you're conscious. So in talking about the importance of consciousness, I'm also talking about the importance and value of that which is conscious, which means all human beings. And, you know, it's very easy if we've got a comfortable life and, you know, we've got a roof over our heads and we've got enough to eat, to say, oh, yes, it's all physical things, and physical experience is neither here nor there. But if you're someone who's in pain, if you're someone who's starving, if you're someone who's suffering, then you know, the old adage of that the people refute the emptiness, total meaninglessness of physical reality by stubbing their toe, that you know, as soon as you feel the pain, you know there's a reality to it. So what I'm talking about is how it exists. It cannot exist without consciousness, but that doesn't mean it's a dream, it's imagined, or it's not real, or that we should ignore it. I think we're duty bound not to ignore it if we have any sense of concern, empathy, value towards our fellow human beings. And that sort of informs my sort of career choice as well, to want to be a doctor, although medical doctor in the first place. But of course, people can help people in, you know, in many different ways. It's not, but it helps to you know, me to understand that every single human being has limitless value.
What is the mind then? What do you think the mind is?
Very good question. Well, now to tie in consciousness with what we call the mind, what we're basically describing is, how does consciousness exist in individuality? Why is it someone rather than just the all? Now, I referred earlier to Schrödinger and what he was saying about time itself being a product of consciousness, and he made the point. This was in his book that was published in the 1940s called What is Life, and he made the point that in the laws of physics, there's no such thing as a now. There's no such thing as a present. So the whole history of the universe, from the Big Bang to the heat death of the universe, could all be seen as one amorphous lump, if you like. And yet, as conscious beings, we are always now. All we ever experience is now. And the past exists within the now as if you like, how the now has come to be what it is. And also the future exists within the now as potential possibilities. Now, what the point that he made is that because that now, that moment of now, is a fundamental nature of consciousness, without which there would be no time, that time itself is the product of consciousness. Therefore, that which has been created by consciousness cannot have the power to create or destroy consciousness. In other words, as a conscious being, or your consciousness rather, has no beginning or end. Okay, but we know the universe has a beginning. So what actually had a beginning was our separation from each other, the state of existence where we now, I'm here, you are there, and we each have, we exist within the frame and through the context of a physical body that we see through those eyes and speak through that body and so on, and act through it. And that is what the mind is basically consciousness having become separate, consciousness having become limited. Because if consciousness has no beginning, but the physical universe has a beginning, and the physical universe means space, time, and matter, and indeed space and time and matter are merely three words that all attest to the separation of points. That you cannot have separation without space, and you cannot have space without separation, and the same with time and matter. And so what we see then is that if we had no beginning, but separation had a beginning, it stands to reason that in that state, I shouldn't say before the Big Bang, if the Big Bang is where time begins, but beyond the Big Bang, there is a state beyond space, time, and matter where we are all one. That being a timeless state, it's just as real now as it ever was, and hasn't become diminished, because it doesn't change if it's not in time, hasn't become diminished through the fact that we are here. So in a sense, something of us, our consciousness, that which is the same sort of spark, if you like, which is the same in all sentient beings, is actually one and the same, but what has become different is that within that state of all being one, there would also be no limit, no restriction. It would have to be a state of total and complete potentiality and possibilities, with no defined limits or restriction to make demarcations and separation. So what has happened is we have become less than that we have taken on restriction, we've taken on individuality, we've taken on self and selfishness, and all the qualities that divide, whether it be materialism, racism, nationalism, sexism, whatever it is, any of the sort of attitudes of mind that limit us to ourselves and stop us being flexible and being able to learn from others. And to basically the point that I make in the book is that if you look at the people who are now seen as the great religious teachers of the past, I don't actually consider them as religious teachers. I consider them as people who are speaking sense, and religion came afterwards. So, for example, Jesus talking about loving one's neighbor as oneself, he may have been aware that, you know, we come from a state of existence, which is perhaps what he was referring to as his father, where we're all one. Our neighbor is ourselves. And it does make complete sense in those terms, that to undo the restrictions that have happened through the choice to separate, to each become less than we could be and less than we have been, that then limits us to ourselves. And the antidote to that is to recognize that fundamental unity, not as a sort of just as an intellectual recognition, but if one really recognizes it fully, so in the sense of the mind and heart together, if you like, and in the being together of that person, of course, not referring to the pump that sits in the chest, putting figuratively to the heart. So where heart and mind and being are together in that recognition, so that everything we are, everything we do is sort of based upon that recognition. I think that's what basically that particular individual, will be talking about the Turin Shroud later, the evidence pointing to the man of the shroud having been the historical Jesus of Nazareth, showed us what can happen if you take that to its full extent, if you totally and completely have that sense of perfect empathy, which is basically informs your whole being and all you are and all that you do. And so in a sense you have a continuum with him and anyone who becomes like him on one extreme, and you've got the complete sort of psychopath at the other that has no empathy at all. But I think what he was demonstrating was that full human potential, which in fact I think all of the other great teachers have also alluded to, such as for example the Buddha 500 years earlier said, Buddha actually is a word meaning the awakened one, in the sense that we have been we're deluded and not seeing true reality. And he said all sentient beings are Buddhas, but they've been temporarily obscured. Remove that obscuration and they are Buddhas indeed. So he wasn't setting himself out as a unique exception, and actually neither was Jesus. Jesus said that although he referred to his father and he as being one and the same, and referred to him as his father, he referred to him as our father. And he said that anyone who does my father's will is my brother, my sister. So those people would also be sons and daughters of God if he was. And also more explicitly, he said, you know, blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called children of God. And he said, is it not written, you are gods and children of the Most High? So I don't think he was trying to set himself up on a pedestal and saying, this is, you know, I'm just showing you what you can never be, and don't try and be like me, just fear me or ask for forgiveness or whatever. Quite the opposite. He said, you know, all these things you see me do, you can do also. So yeah, I think, I don't think any of these people were actually attempting to found religions. I think they were, as he said, bearing witness to the truth.
So would you say that we existed beyond time, before time, and that we exist beyond time now? That our relationship to as human beings, our relationship to time is actually, it goes beyond it itself, and it's related to a right now as it is.
Yeah, so we exist beyond time, but in our beyond time state, that we are all one. So we exist there in our unblemished form, but in our unblemished form, in terms of being perfection is one. There's nothing to differentiate one person from the other, but it's very much still you as what is looking through your eyes and hearing through your ears now. That consciousness is there because that state is an experience state. It's not an object. It's not like a something that a dead static, dependent, like a statue that is just there with nothing to, because it's, when we think of beyond time, it's difficult to think of it without imagining the contexts of time. So we imagine something that just stays exactly as it is, but we're imagining time passing while it stays exactly as it is. But this is the now, but it's all possible now. It's all contained within a potentiality and a reality that is consciously experienced. Basically, I think the clue to it, to understanding it, is that sense of, we're becoming to near-death experiences later, but in that light that people experience, that they feel all is one and they feel loved by that light. So where people have a sense of being loved and of loving, that unconditionally and selflessly, then that is the perhaps one way that we can try to imagine, a tiny glimpse of what that state would be like, of being the all, containing all being within us, and all knowledge, without decay, without death, without pain. So it's not something where time passes. It's not something where you can have boredom, if you like.
So would you say time and empathy, time and love are that they're linked? They're intrinsically linked, would you
I
say?
would say that that time exists in the sense that we understand time in terms of change and limitation and separation, because of the absence of those things, or because they're not, there's some limit and restriction. So it's not, it's the combination of the two. So you can't have a shadow without light. So this world is the world of shadow in that sense, the physical world, but it's only made real because there is light there. There is that potential, and there is that eternal state through which we can exist in order to perceive that shadow. But it is shadow because it's less than that state of total empathy, of oneness. It's become separation. So it's really the fact that we have become less than our full potential, which makes us separate and divided. And time, and remember that, I mean, the point, I believe, is that time, in terms of change, is based upon what physicists call the second law of thermodynamics, that everything goes from a state of prior order into more and more chaos and decay, in a sense. And this is the realization of that. I'm saying that the initial choice to be separate is being carried to its logical conclusion, that everything is breaking apart. So the natural tendency in this world is for decay, and this is what I think the Buddha alluded to in terms of what he referred to as impermanence, and Jesus alluded to it as well when he referred to this as a world of moths, rust, and thieves, where nothing lasts, but that there's another state of being where there is no decay, and that is the state that is beyond time, beyond space, beyond separation, that he demonstrated a route map of how to achieve it, that I believe can be understood through reason, rather than there's no necessarily requirement to accept it on as a dogma or faith or anything like that, because actually, like I say, it makes sense, and it does fit together into a cogent, coherent picture.
So in this world of AI, and where we can potentially upload our consciousness onto a computer chip and put it into our heads, do you think that's possible? Do you think, for example, to escape the the moth and decay, where everything is changing, where everything, do you think that's possible for us in
Well,
consciousness?
the case that I make in the book is that people are making a sort of fundamental mistake that's possibly the most fundamental error one can have in reason, because the most fundamental observation that we have is of consciousness. And what people confuse is they conflate the state of being aware with the information that you're aware of. Okay. But being aware is more than this, and this isn't something. This isn't a new point I'm making. This is actually thousands of years ago in the Indian texts known as the Upanishads. The author makes a distinction between what's the eye and the ear, and the eye. So it refers to they refer to the eye of the eye and the ear of the ear. Okay, that beyond the physicality of that which is receiving information is the being and the perception of the one who experiences that. So ultimately, information, however complex and advanced it is just a string of ones and zeros. My contention is it doesn't matter how long you make a string of ones and zeros, it's never going to reach a length where suddenly it stops becoming something and becomes someone. So you are not the information in your brain, okay? You are that which perceives information. So, for example, yes, you can say, but you're aware, and when you're aware as an individual who has lots of memories. Those memories are information. Okay, so someone keeps a diary of all their experiences throughout their life. Is that diary them? Is that diary a person? You see, this is my point, that to have the information contained within something doesn't make it aware of that information. And so when if you put the information onto a chip, which will never actually be all the information that you have, because it's not going to, you can't put onto a chip the information of what it's like to be conscious. People say, how do you define consciousness? Okay, and they'll say, oh, it can't be anything of significance because no one can really say what it is, so it's all relative. But actually, when you look at what we're doing when we're defining something, we're always comparing it to something else. Okay, so any definition will have to do that by its very nature. But with consciousness, you cannot reduce it to that kind of description. You know what consciousness is because you are conscious. But if you were to try to express that in a form that a computer could understand, what is it like actually to perceive information? Rather, it could never understand that. But in fact, that's the point, is that the computer can never understand anything. It's an object that's no less an object. It's no more conscious. All it does is process information like an abacus does. Okay, so a computer may have lots more switches and nodes of variation of whether it's a 0 or a 1, but in principle, it's just the same as the abacus.
Can a computer learn?
Well, you see, it depends what one means by learn, of course. If by learn you mean that it can change what it does according to information that's fed into it, then yes. And the example that I give, though, is a pebble on the beach, okay, that's sitting there while the waves come and go. And you could say, oh, the pebble is learning how to survive because it's getting eroded into the shape that offers the least resistance to the waves. It's not really learning anything. Or you can have an object that is you're molding into a certain shape, and it has while it's doing that, it has something in its structure that shows how it was, how it is, and so on. But it's still not aware of anything. So the computer, when the computer is able to change what it does based on information that has been fed through it, it hasn't actually experienced any of that information. So though people call it machine learning, it's a sort of anthropomorphism, if you like. We know that when we learn, we're aware of new information, but the computer is not aware of anything. It's the connection between input and output has been changed by some of the input, so that new input will now lead to different output because of information that has been put through it. But nowhere is there someone who's experiencing that. That's the distinction I make. The computer is always something, not someone.
You mentioned David Bohm in your book.
Yes.
Have you ever listened to his interviews with Krishnamurti?
I read his book actually about 40 years ago, I think, called The Ending of Time, when I was very young, which he wrote with Krishnamurti. Yeah,
Krishnamurti has some very good insights into computers, and like he was making these predictions or giving these views back in the 70s.
that's right. I saw a speech he did on YouTube talking about the dangers of it even then. Obviously it didn't go on YouTube then, but it's been uploaded onto there now. Yeah, so that's right. I'm not claiming to be the first to say this by any means, but my point is that if you listen to people like Martin Rees or Stephen Hawking when he was alive, they're both. I think Stephen Hawking was part of something in Cambridge called the Centre for the Study of Existential Risk. And there's also something called the Future of Humanity Institute in the University of Oxford in England. And these both of those organizations were set up to consider, what might be the potential things that could lead to the end of humanity. And both of them, leading figures in both of them, have come to the conclusion that one of the most likely explanations for how humanity could end is through the unanticipated consequences of technology. And they give examples such as you develop some kind of artificial intelligence that's designed to prevent human suffering. But to a machine, the most efficient way of preventing human suffering is either to wipe out all human beings or to keep them anesthetized all their life on heroin drips, because there's no way it can really understand. There's no way a machine can ever have empathy. It's impossible for it to feel, because it can't even be aware in order to experience feeling. And in fact, I'm sure both Stephen Hawking and Lord Martin Rees have said that if we were to come into contact with extraterrestrial life, so to speak, or intelligence, that most probably it wouldn't be something living. It wouldn't be a living, sentient, what they call organic intelligence being. It would be machine, because what they're saying is that once a civilization develops advanced technology, including things like artificial intelligence, it's a very short period of time before the living intelligence becomes redundant and is ended. And the fallacy, the notion of mind uploading is a good example, because, as I say, it's a contradiction in terms, because the mind is not information. The mind includes that which perceives it. But because people miss that important point, that they will try to maintain their existence by implanting information into a machine, and then perhaps incinerate the body that the information came from, because that's irrelevant now. You're going to be in that machine and live forever. And actually, that's how one of the ways that humanity may end as a living species on this planet. So actually Martin Rees wrote a book called Our Final Century, where talking about the 21st century. And so a lot of these these aren't sort of religious fanatics going around with the board saying the end is nigh. These are this is mainstream. It's some of the leading scientists in our world who are telling us that humanity's days may be quite short as a result of the headlong rush into AI and the what do they call it, something transhumanism, and this notion of mind uploading and so on, may mean that it won't be that many generations before there aren't any more human beings. And you would have thought that to hear this, that kind of revelation, that I would have thought, you know, there would be then some kind of mass movement of people campaigning, you know, to preserve humanity and to, but it's amazing how, you know, they say that the ending not with a bang but with a whimper, that people, not many people seem to be particularly bothered by it, or perhaps you know, not enough people are aware of it. I suppose maybe that's the thing. But yeah, I mean, I am bothered, and that's one of the reasons why I wrote the book.
Going back to, so consciousness cannot be, in your opinion, it cannot be manufactured. Is consciousness, could it be a product of matter, as some scientists argue? Do you think matter can cause consciousness?
I would say that consciousness cannot be a product of evolution, creation, or manufacture. In fact, it can't be a product of anything because it has no beginning, and anything that is a product must have a beginning. I argue that through using simple logic and reason, that it can, and this following the same lines that Erwin Schrödinger set out around 80 years ago, that it can't have a beginning, and if it can't have a beginning, it can't be made by a god, it can't be made by evolution, it can't be made by technology. That none of those things, it can't be made, but it always is, it always exists. And interestingly, the notion of you know, mind or consciousness being made by matter is quite interesting, because of course quantum theory tells us the opposite, that matter exists because of consciousness, that until it's actually observed, that the actual properties of matter are just possibilities, potentials. And now, of course, there are many physicists who believe that that observation could be made by a machine, that it's not really about consciousness. But there are also plenty, and Andre Linde, who I mentioned among them, would point out that that machine is also a quantum object. And it was, I think, von Neumann, who is actually, interestingly, one of the founders of the theory that led to the development of computers, ironically. But he referred, there's something that's known as the von Neumann chain, that at the end of it, it only becomes actual defined thing once it can be perceived, once it, and that perception implies consciousness at the end of the line. And so that means that, and again, as I say, Andre Linde made this point, and people may be interested to see his video on the website Closer to Truth, where he is being interviewed, and he talks about how quantum physics led him to this conclusion, this professor of physics from Stanford, that consciousness must be fundamental. In fact, I've got the photocopies of cuttings from the London Observer newspaper from the 1930s, where both Max Planck and Owen Schrödinger were both interviewed by a journalist called Sullivan, I think it was. They were both asked, what do they think about consciousness and its relation to matter? And both of them independently, these two founders of quantum theory, and both Nobel laureates and two of the greatest physicists who ever lived, said that they believe consciousness is fundamental. It's not the product of anything else. It's not made by matter. And as Schrödinger pointed out in his book, it doesn't have any beginning in time, but the opposite is true. Time exists because of consciousness. And so there you have a sort of, I lay out in the book in more detail, a sort of logical reasoned argument that demonstrates that ultimately we as conscious beings, we are eternal, but that our separation and our limitation has a beginning. The physical universe, yes, that has a beginning, but the capacity to perceive and know and experience, that has no beginning, and it need have no end.
Dr. Silverman, how does free will play into consciousness? How does it play into time?
Yes, so now when we say that there is a now which contains, in a sense, that the past and the future are contained within the now. The future not fixed though, because there is this capacity, because we're aware of options, that we can choose between them. Now, it's important to, of course, to be clear that the fact that choice is free doesn't mean that we can necessarily have whatever we want. But even if there are restrictions on what choices we can make, if we can choose freely between those options, then that freedom is absolute. I call it in the book, I refer to it as primary causation, because there can't be anything. There can be things that influence things one way or the other, but nothing actually. The choice itself is the cause, and so that's basically, those are the two sides of consciousness as it interacts, as we interact with each other and with the universe, in a physical universe. That there is the awareness and there is the will. So and each one sort of implies the other, in the sense that if there is will, there must be awareness of options for you to choose between. And if you have awareness, then you do have the capacity to have choices between the options that are available. So even if you're locked up in a room, your mind is still free to think, as you choose to think.
So do you think free will, like time and causality, and to be in a world of things, that it goes hand in hand, that in order to exercise our free will, we have to be in this plane of time?
Yes. So in that sense, that in the state of where we're all one, then will is there, but it's not being, we're not making decisions. Exactly that. And in fact, again, in the book, I refer to this, in that, that with people like Jesus saying, love thy neighbor as thyself, this notion of empathy being the antidote that undoes our restriction, limit, and so on. That it's interesting that where people are moved to have acts of compassion through empathy, in responding to a need or suffering in someone else, that it actually happens without them needing to choose to do it. It's not it doesn't need to be a conscious choice. So someone who cares, maybe on a train, and someone loses their footing and is about to fall, and they may reach out to help stop them. They don't actually need to choose to do it. Just as you don't choose to care. Caring is a product of of who you are and what you are, and so it's implicit. So in that sense, the very nature of love and compassion is that it expresses will in its passive form without needing to make a decision. It's completely spontaneous. So yes, but choices are do sort of lay out our pathway. We're always making choices, and as you say, to making decisions implies time in which to make them. So in that sense, to be making active choices sets us out as temporal beings, and so I don't. That's why if I tend not to use the word God much in the book, because it means so many different things to different people. But that state of perfect oneness or complete knowledge and freedom, and as people in near-death experiences describe it, complete love, is not a creator or a puppet master, or it's unconditional. So it's just like the sun is always shining, whether you put clouds in the way and block it out or not. So it is with that state and how it of being and how it interacts with us. So it's not a case of dispensations or rewards or punishments. In fact, on the subject of when people experience their near-death experiences and they see this, they experience, I should say, is a probably more accurate than to say just they see this light and the warmth and compassion and knowledge that is they somehow feel from that light, and they have their what's known as life review.
What are near-death experiences? What are they?
Sure. So basically, what happens is that where someone has had for example, a cardiac arrest, where the heart stops beating, and within about 10 seconds, the brain waves become completely flat. The brain is completely not active at all. Now, many people who have been resuscitated following cardiac arrest recall very clear, vivid experiences that seem to, last a long time, where they experience lots of different things, even if they were just the cardiac arrest was only for a short period of time, and often they part of it is what's known as veridical experience. So they say that during the cardiac arrest, they were looking down as though from around the ceiling, looking down on what was happening, and they could see the resuscitation. They could see their own body there on the hospital trolley or whatever, and all the people working on them. They could hear what they were saying, which is interesting because they're taking in this information while their brain is not functioning, while their physical senses are not working, and while they shouldn't, according to a common understanding of neurophysiology of how the brain works, they shouldn't be able to be taking on new information. So that in itself provides evidence. And you see, for example, the two people that you quoted earlier who kindly made comments about my book, which are on the cover of it, Dr. Eben Alexander is a neurosurgeon, and he came to be interested in near-death experiences because he had one. And until that point, I'm not sure that he had any particular view about it, but then he realized it was a reality because he experienced it for himself. And that he realized in retrospect that while this was happening, his brain wasn't able to be processing any information, and yet he had all of this rich and vivid experience. And Dr. Pim van Lommel, whom you also quoted, as a cardiologist, he was treating patients who had had cardiac arrest and been resuscitated, and so he heard about near-death experiences from his patients, and so that became a interesting subject of study. And so many people during the near-death experience, they experience this light, and they experience, which appears to, they somehow know that all knowledge is contained within that light, and that the light is somehow, that it's a sense of that it's loving them, that it's welcoming them as though they're part of that light, and that they often have what's known as a life review, where they experience from the beginning until the stage that they are now what has happened in their life. But the interesting thing is that consistently, many of the people who have had this experience, they say that they were experiencing it from the perspective not of how they experienced their life, but they're seeing it from the perspective of the other people that they had interacted with. So where they had done something that was perhaps where they hadn't cared about someone and caused harm to them through that, they were experiencing what that felt like to the other person. Where they had been kind to someone else, they were experiencing what that kindness felt like. And so they don't describe it as though the light or the being who is sort of talking to them, if there is one, is judging them. They feel like they're forming a judgment themselves of themselves. And that would make perfect sense, that actually, that if something is unconditional, it doesn't hand out rewards and punishments and favors and so on. It's unconditionally there for everyone, but we don't allow it into us. We limit ourselves. We make shadow rather than light because of our restrictions and limitations that divide, like selfishness and all the other isms that I was referring to.
So apart from Eben's near-death experience, what other example do you think is a very convincing story of a near-death experience? Like, are they predominantly good or bad, or is it a combination of both?
That's a very good question. Yeah, I mean, there's two aspects to it. There's the veridical aspect. So, for example, the doctor who was seeing a patient on a ward round who had had a near-death experience, who said that they had been looking from above the hospital and had seen that several stories up there was a slipper on a ledge. This is a place where that patient had never been, and the doctor went and investigated and actually found that that slipper was actually there. Yes, you're right. So there are some negative experiences as well, which is part of what I was alluding to. So where people have done something that has been harmful to others through not caring and so on, that they experience what that felt like to the other person. So they perceive it from the other person's perspective, and experience the harm that caused, and what it felt like. So yes, there are that sort of negative sense as well as the positive in a lot of near-death experiences. But generally, when they eventually come back to the body, because of course all the people who are recounting these tales have been resuscitated, then often their lives are changed by that recognition, because it's now a reality to them. It's not a case of someone told me we continue when we die, and well, some people believe it and some people don't. It's just becomes an experienced fact to them that they have seen for themselves.
And you say that they always see the light. Can you talk more of the light, the nature of that light that they see?
Many people recount having seen light, yeah, or experienced light, and so it's often referred to as being brighter than any light that they've experienced before, but it's not painfully bright. It's not burning their eyes, so to speak, and that that they feel that somehow within that light is complete and perfect unconditional love towards them, and that they are somehow welcomed into that light, and that's their true home, so to speak. Now it's interesting, you mentioned David Bohm earlier, and he was in an interview once. He was asked, why do you think light is often mentioned in as a in where people are talking about spiritual matters, or matters beyond the physical, beyond physical life? And he made an interesting point about what Einstein himself had discovered about light, which is that anything that is, this is according to the simple equations of relativity, anything which is, for anything which is at the speed of light, of course light itself is at the speed of light, then what the equations tell us is that there is no separation. That from you've probably heard about, spaceships moving and clocks seeming to be different depending on where you are and how you look at it and so on. Well, from the perspective of a light beam, there is no time and space. Both, it's called on space-time diagrams, it's called that they call it the null cone, which is where light exists, because along that cone there's no null because of zero separation in space, zero separation in time. So for a light beam, if you like, the origin and destination of it, we see the light, it went from here and it went to there, looking at it from not being light, if you like. But from the perspective of light itself, here and there is the same place. There's no separation between them in space, and it left here then and it arrived here now, or another then, right?
Is this the arrow of time?
Yeah, well, sort of, yes, but to the light beam, the time it left the origin and the time it arrived at the destination is the same time. There is no arrow, if you like, in that sense, because it's all one. So actually, and he also said that matter is actually frozen light, that it's actually taken on location, space and time and separation by no longer being light, and becoming localized as light that has taken on a location in space, and it's therefore frozen in to generate space and time through separation. So it helps us see perhaps that light may be seen as in a way interface between our state of being in separation and our state of being as all as one. And so that perhaps that light that they perceive in near-death experiences is actually real, and that is actually a closer understand. They're seeing closer to the fundamental ground of all reality than we perceive with our eyes and ears, so to speak, or through our eyes and ears. And when we come to the Turin Shroud later, then I hope the viewers and listeners will see how this actually ties in together to create a sort of cogent, coherent picture, which I sort of elaborate on a lot more in a lot more depth and detail in the book, regarding how such a phenomenon could occur.
Well, just before we come to the shroud, the Turin Shroud, I just want to mention 4 other things you're not advocating in relation to this. In your book, you say you're not advocating creationism. You're not advocating any particular religion and any notion of a miracle that needs to be invoked to explain the shroud. And you're not advocating dualism. So would you like to just speak about that, expand on that a bit?
Sure.
Those 4 points.
Thank you. Yeah. So in the sense that we have no beginning, that means that we haven't been created. It's our separation and our limit and restriction that have beginnings. And so I argue a case that that restriction is made by us. It's not imposed on us by an unconditional, timeless being who, in any case, if that being were doing something like that, then it would no longer be eternal, perfect, and limitless. It would be being a temporal being itself. So now, of course, people say, how can that be so? How can we have chosen to be separate if until the choice is made, there isn't a someone there to make the choice? And this which is an interesting question, but I can answer that, because that people say that in a sense you're defined by the choices that you make. So someone who can change to become they can previously have been kind and compassionate, and they might suddenly flip and do the opposite, and because they have made a choice that was the opposite of what they were, they now are that person that did that, and they've changed their by developing a habit of experiencing, making that choice the other way towards separation rather than union. The type of person that they are is now different to the type of person that they were before that choice was made. Now, in a sense, then the choice and the chooser are one and the same. That it's not one happening before the other, that it's always the now. We're always in the now, and as soon as within that now the choice is made to be less than complete and less than whole, then that choice is the same as a Big Bang happening. It's the same as the beginning of time, the beginning of separation, space, time, and matter. And it's by that choice happening, the chooser is also happening as a separate individual. What's happening is that they have made separation through the choice, and so therefore defined individuality and separation, and that therefore that we have that our consciousness, our sentience has no beginning, but our restriction and limitation as self has a beginning, and that's not a created beginning by something external to us. We're responsible for our own choices, and those are the real consequences of the choices that physical universes and so on happen, and those universes are they really do, this universe does exist, and within it there is for example, take the example of humanity. There are people suffering and so on, and there's disease and death and hunger and homelessness. And now what I'm not saying is that therefore anything that adverse that happens to someone is their fault, or that they have chosen it. I'm not saying that at all. In fact, especially since a lot of the harmful things that happen to people are inflicted on them by other people, and you don't choose what somebody else does. And also because we exist in this physical world, which is chaotic. And the example that's often quoted of chaos is the butterfly flapping its wings that makes is responsible for a storm happening thousands of miles away. Now, one could consider the possibility that the butterfly may have chosen to flap its wings, but I would argue surely that the butterfly didn't choose to make a storm. So in that same sense, the vast majority, because this is a chaotic universe, bad things happen, and it doesn't mean that everyone who has a bad thing happens deserves it happening to them, especially because we know that can't possibly make sense if if there is such a thing as free, if we say they deserve it because there's free will, but other people have free will as well, and if they can use that free will to harm someone or to leave someone in suffering or without food or whatever, then we are responsible for each other as well. So I say yes, it's exactly as you said, that that I'm not advocating a creator. I'm in the sense of that us having been made as we are, or the being put into this world. I believe we have put ourselves into this world, and that our consciousness makes the universe real. Any consciousness anywhere in the universe makes it real. Without that, there would be no distinction between the Big Bang and the heat death of the universe would be one and the same. There'd be no now between them to allow for time to exist. So time is actually, I would say, the confluence of the forever and the never, if you like, between the eternality of consciousness and the limitation and separation that happens through us being separate and restricted and less than our full potential. So, and the other point about the Turin Shroud I'll demonstrate in more depth, I hope, when we talk about that.
Just about the miracles, have you ever read David Hume's essay on miracles?
No, I've not read that.
Where he says that any miracle is a violation against nature, and that he disagreed with. He basically was that he didn't believe in miracles because they were direct violations against nature. It's a good essay. I was just
Yeah,
going to ask you. It seems like when you say you're not advocating the notion that a miracle needs to be, we need a miracle to explain the image on the shroud. Like it sounds like a miracle happened in that with the shroud. Well, first of all, can you actually just tell us what the Shroud of Turin is and why
sure.
it's still a mystery? Maybe we can get into the miracles then.
Okay, so the Turin Shroud is a piece of linen cloth. I think it's about 14 foot by 4 foot wide, which contains blood stains on it, which have been looked at by forensic pathologists, and it's been deduced that it once contained the recently deceased body of a man who had been whipped, he'd been tortured with a couple of sharp objects placed upon his head, and he'd been crucified, basically, according to the way that the Romans used to do it, which incidentally, despite all the medieval paintings showing a nail through the hand, we actually know from archaeological findings, it actually, the nail would have gone through the wrist. And also that's derived from the from anatomical studies that have been done, and that showing that the hand wouldn't be able to take the weight of the body. Now, the cloth was it has a history that many argue that, if you trace the line of evidence, does take it all the way back to Jerusalem 2000 years ago. Now, the thing is that, of course, one can't mention the Turin Shroud without mentioning perhaps the carbon dating. Okay, that's the elephant in the room, perhaps, if we don't mention it, of me saying that it's actually 2000 years old. Interestingly, I was doing a science degree, what's known as an intercalated science degree, during my medical degree, when the journal Nature published the article about the radiocarbon dating of the shroud. And I noticed, this was in early 1989, I think they published it, and I remember noticing in the results section there was a little table of the evidence where they had the results from the 3 different labs that had done the dating, and the interesting and they had the date that each lab came out with what's known as error bars on either side of it. Okay, so it's that this date plus or minus, and 2 of the labs were such that the error bars didn't overlap. So in other words, it looked as though those 2 labs, from this tiny piece of the cloth that was taken that was 7 centimeters by 1 centimeter, that they had tested cloths that had different ages, which is interesting because they're both testing the same cloth. So I noticed that was strange. And then there were 2 researchers. One was Joe Marino and his wife, Sue Benford, who's sadly died since then. And they noticed that there were anomalies that corner of the cloth from where the sample was taken. They, on some of the studies that had been done on the shroud, that corner looked different to other parts of the cloth. And they came up with the notion that, and they discovered that there's something called invisible reweave, which is a technique for repairing cloths, which has been around for many centuries. And this is a corner of the cloth, which the corners would have been the most handled through the centuries, through the expositions when they're holding it and so on. And also, it's thought that bits of it were chopped off to to give away or sell as relics or whatever. And that therefore it could have been repaired, and so they put this forward, and they spoke to a chap called Raymond Rogers, who was a chemist, a scientist at Los Alamos Laboratories, and Raymond Rogers had, up until the point of the carbon dating, because nobody could account for how an artist or a forger could have made the image on the shroud. We'll come to the image a bit later. He was of the view that this is authentic, that the image and the bloodstains are there because it really did hold the body of a recently deceased and crucified man, and that the image was that man's image, that it hadn't been made by a forger or an artist. But then, when he heard the carbon dating, because he was a open-minded scientist and he was just basing his opinions on the evidence, he said, oh, okay, then maybe I was wrong. Maybe it is medieval. But then, so Benford and Marino contacted him and put their theory to them, and he was initially annoyed by it, and he referred to them as these fringe researchers trying to going against the evidence of science. Well, I have the samples to be able to prove them wrong in 5 minutes, because I've got bits of cloth from the corner that was dated, and I've got bits from other parts of the cloth. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to prove them wrong and show that it's all the same cloth. And he went on, he did the actual study, and he found that actually it's chemically completely different. That the area where the sample was taken from had a very different material composition to the rest of the cloth, which would actually be consistent with the Sue Benford and Joe Marino's hypothesis that that particular part of the cloth had been rewoven and repaired with much more recent, perhaps 16th century material, and that would, of course, account for why the different radiocarbon labs came out with different dates, because there's different proportions of the newer cloth with the original. And so Raymond Rogers actually wrote up his research in a peer-reviewed scientific journal called Thermochimica Acta, and he went on video to say, I set out to prove them wrong. I've actually proved them right. That this cloth, where the carbon dating was done from, is not representative of the rest of the cloth. Now, I don't go along with sort of conspiracy notions that the labs did this. You know, some people say they did it deliberately and blah blah blah. I think I wouldn't accuse anyone of that. I think that there was some sort of perhaps incompetence shown, in the sense that they didn't follow the initial, they didn't include the team of scientists. You see, I haven't mentioned, but in around 1978, a team of scientists called the Shroud of Turin Research Project was commissioned from such places as Jet Propulsion Laboratory, NASA, and so on, to go and spend some time doing scientific studies on the shroud. And Barry Schwartz was the official photographer of that group. So he was part of the Shroud of Turin research project, and he often tells that, you know, that they expected to go there because he himself comes from an Orthodox Jewish background, and they would come from all sorts of different backgrounds of people there. They had no preconceptions about what they would find when they looked at the shroud, but they thought the most likely thing, you know, as one normally expects, if you see it as a religious relic, which of course I don't, I see it as an artifact of historical artifact that has evidence, but if you see it, the religious relics, many of them, you know, they say that if you put together all the pieces of the true cross, it'd be much bigger than a giant redwood tree, and and so on. That there was a sort of, that they went there and they expected to be able to see the brushstrokes in 5 minutes and then go home again. So they were astonished to find that when they got there, that actually it was nothing of the kind, that none of them could account for how not just a medieval artist or forger, but even a modern day one would be able to produce an image like this. So I haven't mentioned the image in detail yet. So on the sort of superimposed close to, but not exactly aligned with the image, and I'll come back to that later, as close to but not exactly aligned with the bloodstains, is the image of a man, both front and back, as though the shroud had been that the dead body had been laid on the cloth, and then it had been sort of folded over the top of the head, and it was also over the front of him as well. And we see an image of the front and the back of the man with a gap between them that would coincide with the top of the head. And that's interesting that that there isn't an image of the top of the head, but we'll come back to that later. So the and when you actually, as the Stirp team did, when you study this in detail, and partly what led to the Stirp team being formed is one of the scientists, a physicist by the name of Dr. John Jackson. He was looking at pictures of the shroud using something called an image intensifier, which had been used to look at X-ray images and things like that, that converts the brightness of an image into relief. So you get a sort of three-dimensional image from a two-dimensional object. And now what they noticed is that if they put ordinary, like photographs or paintings or anything like that, into the image intensifier, that they would get a random set of peaks and troughs that wouldn't sort of fit with the three-dimensional shape of the person who was being sort of represented in that photograph or painting. But with the shroud image, it came out into relief so that they could see the three-dimensional shape of the man. And which was strange, because he was thinking, you know, how could an artist have known to put that in, and how did they put it in to this image? So that, you know, he was interested to study it more. And when they did study it at with the STURP team, and I think it was something like 120 hours of round the clock access to the shroud that was given to them by its then owner. And now at that time it was the property of the House of Savoy in Italy, which was the royal family of Italy. Later, after that, it was bequeathed to the Pope, and so technically now it's the property of whichever Pope is in position at the time. But at that time it belonged to the House of Savoy, and he allowed them access to it for 120 hours to do all the tests, non-destructive tests that they wished to upon it. And what they found was that actually the image on the cloth doesn't consist of anything that's been, any chemicals that have been added to the cloth. That where they looked at the blood stains, they saw, as one would expect, that the blood had seeped through the cloth. And but if paint or something like that had been applied, that would also have done that. But actually, when they do all the studies of the material of the cloth, they find that the material where the image is the same material as the other parts of the cloth, except it's had chemical changes known as oxidation and dehydration, which turned it slightly to a sepia yellow color, which is exactly what happens when you leave paper out in sunlight. That it also contains cellulose, and the ultraviolet light will cause this oxidation and dehydration, which turns it slightly yellow, just as the image is. And now the thickness of the image is 200 nanometers, which is 1/5000th of a millimeter. And it's not, wherever there's image, it's the same amount of discoloration as anywhere else. So Barry Schwartz often explains it that it's like the dots of a newspaper print, that that one dark or one white dot is the same as any other, but it's the density of them that gives the brightness of the image. So it's how many of the fibrils had been discolored that determines the intensity of the image. It's an all or nothing thing. So Barry will often say that for an artist to have done it, he would have had to, and also you can't actually see it from close up. You have to be a couple of meters away from the cloth. So he would have had to have a brush that was that long, and yet able to these microscopic fibrils to make the changes in them, in each one separately. With only the thing is that he couldn't do that either, because he or she couldn't have done that either, because they're not made by anything that's been added to the cloth. They're made by oxidation and dehydration. And so then see, the question is, how did such a thing happen? Now, one of the strongest sort of scientific research that's been done in that regard, the most evidence-based, empirical, reproducible, and so on, that has been done on this, it's actually taken place at the Atomic Energy Institute in Frascati, Italy. It's called ENEA. It's a team of scientists, in many ways led by Dr. Paolo Di Lazzaro. And that what they have done is they've, using short, intense bursts with an ultraviolet laser, sort of nanoseconds, so billionths of a second, that these blasts from the laser onto the cloth, onto linen, will make a similar change to the linen as the one that we see on the shroud. Okay, but this is is 20th or 21st century technology, okay, but it's not actually making the whole image of the shroud. It's making one little dot that is similar to the to what's on the shroud, and even then that dot is you know, covering a large area, whereas on the shroud we see the individual pixels, if you like, that some fibrils are changed and some aren't. And he was explaining that that it would take something like hundreds of billions of watts to be able to do this, technologically, and that's more than the power output of something like a nuclear reactor, for example. Now, it's important, of course, to distinguish power from energy. I'm not saying that, but it would have, if it had been a huge amount of energy that had created the image, then you would expect the whole cloth to have been vaporized. But of course, power is to do with the rate at which that energy is transferred, how quickly it happens. That's why you know, our sort of electricity bills and so on, they say kilowatt hours. So you multiply power by time to get energy. So this, because it was such a short duration, such an instantaneous event, that's why the power output is so high, rather than the energy being so high. Now, the interesting thing, though, is that it appears as though this radiant burst of radiant energy appears to have been in one axis sort of forwards and backwards, as it were, that the front and the back, but not on over the top of the top of the head. And the most fascinating thing, which I have to say is not something that I realized myself, and I probably would never have seen it, except it was pointed out because I did speak at the conference that Dr. Di Lazzaro organized, actually at the Atomic Energy Institute in 2010, where I was talking about my ideas about how the image formed, and you know, how we can tie in the nature of mind and matter to understand how such a thing was possible. But one of the other speakers there, Dr. Gilbert Lavoie, explained something which I'd never, which now I've seen it, it seems obvious, but it didn't occur to me until he showed it to me in his talk, which basically is that people assume that the image we're seeing on the shroud is from, you know, a body laid flat in a tomb. Okay, but if you lay a body flat in a tomb, there's several things that will happen. One is that the hair will be going backwards, and the other is that there'll be flattening at the back of, for example, the calves and the buttocks, that there will be and the torso of the body will be flattened because of gravity. Now, some non-medical people will say, oh yes, but that's not the case because you have rigor mortis, which they're right. There is such a thing as rigor mortis, which incidentally, in someone who suffered a violent death, as the man on the shroud from the forensic evidence did, that rigor mortis sets in more quickly and also resolves more quickly, because like everyone realizes, rigor mortis is a temporary phenomenon, and would definitely be expected to have been gone within about 24 to 36 hours, especially if it's someone who had died a violent death. So of course, then people will say, oh yes, but we don't know exactly when the image formed. So fair enough. But even if, let's say for the sake of argument, that rigor mortis was still there, then rigor mortis only affects the muscle, as Dr. Lavoie pointed out. It doesn't affect the skin. It doesn't affect what's known as the two layers of fascia, which the thicker one being the subcutaneous fat, and then there's a layer of fascia around the muscle as well. And they're not affected by rigor mortis. So what we actually see when dead bodies are laid out, even when they do have rigor mortis, is there is still flattening. because somewhere like what the buttocks where under the skin you have subcutaneous fat, that's not muscle, so it doesn't have rigor mortis, it will be flattened. But on the shroud image, what you see, and this is shown even more through the image intensifier showing the three-dimensional relief, is that the curvature of the body is still there, and the hair is down on the shoulders. So what it suggests, as Dr. Lavoie pointed out, is that we have two different events here. That we have one where, which is a simple contact process, that the body was laid out on the cloth, which was wrapped around the body, and that where there were blood that may have been coagulated or partly coagulated, but still with serum, which is the what exudes from when a blood, when it coagulates, it divides into the clot and a liquid that we know as serum. Now, if you leave it long enough, the liquid from the serum will evaporate and dry out, and then if you have a cloth in contact with that where that person had bled, it won't leave a stain. Okay, and so Dr. Lavoie has done various studies on this, and depending on the humidity, ambient humidity and so on, it can take up to about 90 minutes after the blood was shed before it will be, after that time, it won't transfer. So what it implies is that the man was wrapped in the cloth within 90 minutes of the blood being shed. And as he also pointed out, we know that he was dead when he was wrapped in the cloth, because if he had these wounds, such as, for example, as a doctor, having worked in A&E departments, or in America they call them emergency rooms, that you see that where someone has a scalp laceration, as the man of the shroud did, it bleeds very heavily. And otherwise you'd expect it to be, whereas on the cloth you just see a few little imprints of not imprints, but a few little blood stains from where the cloth had been in contact, implying that he'd stopped actively bleeding, and he stopped actively bleeding because he was dead, as most people are when they're put in the shroud. So there was that moment, and of course, the cloth would have been draped around the body. So what Dr. Lavoie pointed out, which is again obvious to me once I've seen it, once he showed it, is that the blood stains from the face, some of them are superimposed on the image of the hair, which is what you'd expect, because if you drape a cloth around something, say there's some contact process that formed the image, then once you straighten the cloth out, the image is going to be distorted. They call it, I think, the mask of Agamemnon effect, that it will stretch out, and that distortion is there for the blood stains. It's not there for the image. So what we have, therefore, is evidence that at the moment that the bloodstains formed, the cloth was draped around the recumbent body of the man who had recently died after having been tortured and crucified. And then there was a second event, perhaps in the tomb, where it appears as though the body was no longer recumbent; it was vertical. But then, if you look at the position of the feet, it doesn't look like he was standing. So it looks as though this body had moved from the horizontal position to the vertical and is now suspended upright above the ground. And based upon the evidence from Dr. Di Lazzaro and his team's work, it appears that there was a sudden momentary burst of radiant energy that came from the body of the man. And I don't call it upwards and downwards, I call it forwards and backwards. If he was upright, forwards and backwards from what's known anatomically as the coronal plane of the body. So when